in this lesson is ordering rational numbers. So you'll notice here we've got some fractions and some decimals. To me, unless you're really, really comfortable with fractions, it's probably easier to go through and change any fraction that you have into its decimal form. Now, some kids are comfortable with fractions, and they're able to go through and just think through what it would look like as a decimal or as a fraction, a mixed number or whatever, and they're able to still order them. But most kids are not. So maybe your first step is to go through and change each of these fractions into their decimal form. So we're going to go through and use what we learned at the very beginning of the lesson, and we're going to divide these out. So we'll practice once again. If I want to change 9/5 into a decimal, I'm going to do 9 divided by 5. When I do that, I get 1.8. So this I'm now going to look at as 1.8. Okay, this other fraction, well, I know there's a negative, so I'm going to put my negative in front. And then 4 divided by 5, which is 8/10, but I'll go ahead and do that on my calculator. It's 0.8. And I'm just going to put the 0.8, not the 0 in there. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and now look at any of my negative numbers first, because those are always going to be my smallest numbers. So I'm a visual person, so I'm going to mark my negatives in blue. Okay, so there's my negatives. So as I'm looking at those negatives, I'm going to think opposite. Remember, negatives, I have to think in terms of opposite. So if I were to look at those without the negative sign, I would say, well, 2.5 is the biggest. Well, we're working in negative, so that's the smallest. So negative 2.5 is going to sit here. Okay, so I'm done working with that one. I now would say, well, what one's bigger? If it was just the positive numbers, I would say 1.1 is the bigger of the two that I have left there. Well, we're working negative, so the opposite, so that's going to be my next one. And then my last negative is that negative 0.8, which originally was negative and negative 4/5. So I'm going to write it out as that 4/5 there. Okay, so I'm done looking at these. I'm now left with 0.8 and 1.8. Now these are positive numbers. So now I'm going to go ahead and work off of those positive numbers. So what would be my smallest of those two numbers? Well, it would be 0.8. And then lastly, it would be 1.8, which was originally 9/5. Okay, so that's working with ordering rational numbers. Now, like I said, some kids are going to be able to go through and just work off of the fractions, but many are going to have to go through and change those fractions to decimals to be able to compare them. Okay, because if you work fractions, unless you're really good at, breaking things down, maybe seeing pictures, you have to have a common denominator to compare them. Okay, so it's a lot easier to compare decimals. Okay, so my first step, because I like to compare decimals, is I'm going to change each of these into their decimal form. So 11 divided by 5 gives me 2.2. Now there was a negative sign in front of that, so negative 2.2. Okay, and then 15/10. 15 divided by 10 is 1.5 or 1.5. All right, so there's my fractions written out. Okay, so my next step now is I need to find the ones that are the smallest. So those are always going to be my negative numbers. So I'm going to go ahead and circle those. So I'll circle them in red this time. So there's a negative, there's a negative, there's a negative. So we're going to think backwards. I want to find, if those were numbers without negative signs, what would be the biggest number? Well, 2.4 would be. So that's my smallest because it's opposite since it's negatives. Okay, so I'm done with that one. So of my two I have left, I have 2.2 negative and negative 2.25. Now some kids get confused when I've got the first two numbers the same. So here's the thing, if you need to, you can always add a 0 to the end to make it easier to compare. Now I can compare 20 behind the decimal to 25. So since we're working opposites, what would be the bigger of those two? Well, the negative 2.25. So really that's a smaller because it's negative 2.25. So I'm done with that one. Now I have my only other negative left, which was negative 2.2, which was originally negative 11/5. Okay, done. All right, so what I have left are my two blue ones here. And now we're working those positive numbers. So I'm gonna go ahead and look at these and say, okay, what's smaller? 1.5 or 1.6? So I have to kind of change my thinking again. Well, 1.5 would be the smaller. Oops, what did I do wrong? I wrote out 1.5 instead of what it was originally. Originally, it was 15 tenths. So I'm gonna write it out as 15 tenths. And then the last one would be 1.6. Okay, so these take time to get comfortable with. You just need to go slow and work your way through them. Change fractions to decimals. Pick out your negatives. Okay, find the number that would normally be the biggest, and since it's negatives, the biggest would be the smallest. Okay, so I want you to go through and actually do this last one. So you're gonna pause your video and you're gonna work through this one on your whiteboard or a sheet of paper, and then you can restart the video to check yourself. So go ahead and pause your video now and work through transferring these these fractions into decimals if you need to, and then arrange them in order. Okay, so that's the order that you should have ended up getting from this set of numbers. Okay, and hopefully you're going through and you're actually pausing the video and practicing it and then checking yourself. Because obviously, yes, you can get this answer, but that's not going to help you understand as you're going through and taking an assessment how to do that. Okay, so good luck with these guys. The ordering is probably the part that's the part that takes the most time. So just slow down, take your time through those.